There are stories Hollywood knows how to tell. The glamorous divorce, the custody battle, the celebrity child spotted on the street, shielded by bodyguards, growing up in the blur of camera flashes. These are the stories that sell magazines, drive clicks, and keep entertainment news cycles spinning for years. But then there are the stories Hollywood never quite figures out how to tell. The ones that belong not to publicists or tabloids, but to a single person sitting quietly in a room, finally deciding that silence has cost him enough. This is one of those stories. Suri Holmes, the young woman the world spent nearly 2 decades calling Suri Cruise, has not given a dramatic press conference. She has not appeared on a talk show couch, tissue in hand, ready to deliver rehearsed heartbreak to a sympathetic host. She has not written a tell-all memoir or sold her story to the highest bidder. What she has done is something quieter and in many ways far more powerful. She has simply chosen to live differently. And in doing so, she has told the world everything it needed to know. At 19 years old, Suri Holmes is no longer waiting for permission to define herself. The name change, the college acceptance, the life she is quietly building in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon University. Each of these decisions is a sentence in a story she is writing entirely on her own terms. And the world, whether expected to be or not, is paying very close attention. To understand where Suri is now, you have to go back to the beginning, not the beginning the tabloids constructed, full of red carpet appearances and carefully staged family photos, but the real beginning, the one that shaped a little girl long before she had any say in the matter. Suri was born in April 2006, the daughter of Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes, two of the most recognizable faces on the planet. From her very first breath, she was already a news event. Cameras waited outside the hospital. The world speculated about her name, her appearance, what she would inherit from each of her famous parents. She had not yet opened her eyes, and already she belonged to the public in ways that no child ever truly should. Her early childhood, by all outward appearances, looked extraordinary. Private estates, international travel, the kind of material abundance most people only ever see in films. But the picture-perfect exterior concealed tensions that those closest to the family quietly observed long before the rest of the world caught on. The marriage between Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes had always existed inside a very specific framework, one shaped not just by Hollywood's usual pressures, but by the profound influence of the Church of Scientology, an organization that had become central to Cruise's identity and public life for decades. Katie Holmes had converted to Scientology before marrying Cruise, but those who knew her well noted that she never seemed entirely comfortable inside its structure. She was a girl from Toledo, Ohio, raised Catholic, with a close-knit family who reportedly grew increasingly alarmed as the years passed. Friends noticed she rarely moved through the world freely. There were always people nearby, associates whose presence felt less like friendship and more like oversight. The warmth that made her a beloved actress seemed, to many who observed her during those years, to be slowly retreating somewhere private and unreachable. Suri grew up inside all of this without understanding any of it. She knew her father's voice, his warmth, the way he laughed. She knew the feeling of being carried by someone larger than life. She knew her mother's hands, always steady, always close. These were the textures of her earliest world. And then, when she was 6 years old, that world broke apart. In the summer of 2012, Katie Holmes filed for divorce. What the public did not immediately grasp was a degree of strategic precision that had gone into that moment. This was not an impulsive decision made in the heat of a difficult season. By multiple accounts, Katie had been preparing for months, changing phones regularly, carefully managing who had access to her communications, quietly replacing household staff she believed might be, reporting back to the church. She chose New York as her legal jurisdiction deliberately, knowing its family court system would be more favorable to her specific concerns. She filed while Tom was overseas filming, ensuring there would be no opportunity for intervention before the papers were formally submitted. The divorce was finalized in a matter of days. 11 days, to be precise. By Hollywood standards, by any standards, that speed was extraordinary. It suggested that both parties understood this marriage was over in every meaningful sense, and that the only remaining question was the terms under which they would separate. Katie received full custody of Suri. Tom agreed to substantial financial support. What he did not seem to receive, in any meaningful ongoing way, was a relationship with his daughter. Reports from 2013 suggested that Tom had seen Suri only once in a year following the divorce. As the years continued to pass, there were no confirmed visits documented by credible sources, no photographs of father and daughter together, no public acknowledgement of birthdays or milestones. For a man whose every public appearance was carefully managed and documented, this silence was conspicuous. The absence was not accidental. It was a pattern. And a little girl growing up in New York City was living inside that pattern every single day. What does it feel like to grow up watching your father on movie screens rather than across the dinner table? To see his face on billboards and posters in every city you visit, while the phone never rings on your birthday? These are not abstract questions. They are the specific emotional reality that Suri Holmes navigated from age 6 onward, and the weight of that experience shaped her in ways both visible and invisible. Katie Holmes did everything within her power to build a stable and loving life for her daughter. She stepped back from the relentless pace of major Hollywood productions to be physically present. She walked Suri to school. She was there for the ordinary moments that famous parents so frequently sacrifice in pursuit of their careers. By many accounts, the bond between mother and daughter became extraordinarily close, forged not just by love, but by shared experience of a particular kind of loss. But there are things a mother cannot fix simply by being present. She cannot make a father appear. She cannot rewrite the reality of an empty seat at school performances, of watching other children leave with both their parents while you walk out alone. She cannot prevent a daughter from doing the painful arithmetic of realizing that a schedule is not the same thing as a choice, and that a person who truly wanted to be present would find a way. Suri, by all indications, was perceptive far beyond what her age should have required her to be. She learned early how to carry disappointment without displaying it. She learned to be self-sufficient in emotional ways that most children only develop much later, if at all. She rode the subway alone. She managed her own schedule. She was, in the eyes of many who observed her during her teenage years in New York, a remarkably composed and independent young person. What few people acknowledged openly was that this composure had not arrived naturally. It had been constructed, carefully and necessarily, as armor against the pain she had never been given the tools to properly process. As she moved through her early teenage years, Suri began doing what thoughtful young people do when they realize that the adults in their lives have protected them from certain truths for as long as possible. She started looking for answers on her own. The internet, for all its well-documented dangers, gave her access to something genuinely valuable in this case: testimony. Former members of the Church of Scientology had spent years speaking publicly about their experiences inside the organization. Documentaries had been made. Books had been written. Journalists had investigated. A substantial body of first-hand accounts existed, and Suri, old enough now to read critically and think independently, worked her way through them. What she found was not a simple villain and victim story. It was something more complicated and, in certain ways, more difficult to process. She found a portrait of an organization that many former members described as systematically discouraging relationships with people deemed to be outside its boundaries. She found accounts of families fractured not by personal cruelty, but by institutional pressure, by a belief system that treated separation from non-members as a form of spiritual protection rather than a form of abandonment. She found, in other words, a possible framework for understanding something that had never been adequately explained to her. This did not make the pain disappear. Understanding why something happened does not retroactively restore the birthdays that passed without a call, or return to years of a childhood that unfolded without a father's presence. But it did something important. It shifted the story from one of pure personal rejection to one that was larger, more systemic, and in some ways more honest about the forces that shape human behavior in ways people do not always consciously choose. Suri was not naive enough to accept any single explanation as complete. She was, by this point, a teenager with a sharp mind and a healthy skepticism towards simple narratives. But she was also a young woman who had spent years carrying a question that deserved at least an attempt at an answer. And in the quiet of her own reflection, she began building an understanding of her own history that she could actually live with. Turning 18 in April 2024 meant something specific and concrete for Surrey Holmes. It meant that she was no longer legally bound by custody arrangements or subject to decisions made on her behalf by others. It meant that the name she had carried since birth, a name chosen by a man who had been largely absent from her life for over a decade, was now hers to keep or surrender as she saw fit. She chose to surrender it. The legal name change to Surrey Noel Holmes was processed in May 2024. Holmes, of course, is her mother's surname. The choice required no elaborate explanation, though the symbolism was unmistakable to anyone who had followed her story with any degree of attention. This was not an act of anger. People who act out of anger tend to make loud, dramatic gestures designed to wound. Surrey's choice was quiet, deliberate, and oriented entirely towards something she was moving toward rather than something she was trying to hurt. She was choosing her mother. She was choosing the person who had actually been there. The name appeared first in her high school graduation program, then in the cast list for her performance in a school production of the Addams Family musical, and eventually in the acceptance documents for Carnegie Mellon University's School of Fine Arts, where she enrolled to study fashion. Each appearance was another small public confirmation of an identity she had been quietly constructing for years. People who had watched her story from the outside called it a statement, and it was, in a sense, but it was more accurately a conclusion. The final punctuation mark on a chapter that had been building toward this moment since the 6-year-old girl stood in a suddenly quiet house and understood, without being able to articulate it, that her father had chosen to be somewhere else. Carnegie Mellon University is not the obvious choice for a young woman trying to leverage her famous last name into an easy path through life. It is a rigorous, highly competitive institution that takes its program seriously and accepts students based on their actual abilities rather than their celebrity adjacency. The fact that Surrey earned a place there on her own merits, majoring in fashion, a field that requires both creative vision and genuine intellectual engagement, is a detail that deserves more attention than it typically receives in coverage of her story. She arrived in Pittsburgh in the fall of 2024 as Surrey Holmes, not Surrey Cruz. She arrived with a body of work developed through years of quietly pursuing her own interests in New York's creative communities, and with a maturity that her peers will likely find unusual and her professors will almost certainly find refreshing. She arrived, by every account available, as herself, not as a symbol of famous marriage, not as a cautionary tale about celebrity childhood, and not as someone defined by a father's absence. This is, ultimately, the most remarkable thing about her story. Not the name change, though that was significant. Not the university acceptance, though that was earned. The most remarkable thing is that after growing up inside one of the most scrutinized family narratives in modern celebrity culture, after spending a childhood subjected to forces far beyond her control, after carrying the weight of father's inexplicable disappearance from her daily life for more than a decade, Surrey Holmes emerged as a person who is, by all visible measures, genuinely whole. She did not emerge without scars. No honest account of her story would suggest that, but wholeness was never about the absence of damage. It has always been about what a person does with that damage, how they metabolize it, what they build from it, and who they choose to become on the other side. Katie Holmes has never spoken publicly about the details of the dynamic between Surrey and Tom Cruise. She has never offered commentary to reporters, never used late-night television appearances to shift public sympathy in her direction, never allowed bitterness to become part of her public identity, despite having every human reason to feel it. Whatever private pain she has carried through the years of watching her daughter navigate an abandonment she could not prevent, she has carried with a dignity that speaks more clearly than any statement she could have given. Surrey appears to have absorbed this quality from her mother along with everything else. The decision not to perform her pain publicly, not to grant interviews that transform private grief into entertainment content, not to play the role the media has always had waiting for her, the wounded celebrity child finally speaking out, is itself a kind of statement. It says, "My story belongs to me. You do not get to consume it." Tom Cruise has not spoken publicly about his estrangement from Surrey. His representatives have not issued statements. The silence from his side of the story is total and, at this point, so prolonged that it has become its own answer to every question anyone might still be asking on his behalf. What Surrey Holmes has told the world is not contained in a single interview or a dramatic public moment. It is contained in the accumulation of choices she has made since becoming an adult, with the legal freedom to make them. It is in the name she chose. It is in the university she earned her way into. It is in the life she is building in Pittsburgh, quietly, competently, and on entirely her own terms. She has told the world that a child can survive being chosen last, again and again, by someone who was supposed to choose him first. She has told the world that a mother's steady, unglamorous presence across years of ordinary days is more powerful than any number of extraordinary gestures. She has told the world that identity is not inherited from the most famous person in your family tree. It is constructed brick by brick from the experiences you survive and the choices you make in the aftermath. And she has told the world, most powerfully of all, simply by existing and thriving, that the ending of her story was never going to be written by someone else's absence. It was always going to be written by her. The girl who grew up waiting for footsteps that never came and stopped waiting. She has somewhere to be, and for the first time in her life, she is the one who decides where that is.